Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a quick review of Fathers and Children by Ivan Turgenev. This is a book that I've been debating doing like a really kind of deep dive discussion on, but until I kind of get to that, or if there's even any interest in that, I will just do a quick kind of summary of my thoughts on this book because I really do want to talk about it and I really do want to recommend it to folks because I think this is such an underrated Russian classic, which is funny to say because Turgenev is obviously quite famous and I think people generally know who he is. Whenever you see like recommendation lists or greatest Russian authors or greatest Russian books, I've very rarely seen Turgenev on those lists. And even though I haven't read like a ton of Russian authors, I mean, I've read a few, like 6 or 7 now, I think his writing is some of the most beautiful out there. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes trying to convince you guys to pick up Fathers and Children or any of his other stuff, because I think his writing is just such a breath of fresh air, particularly as it relates to other Russian authors that I've read. I'll give you a quick summary of what Fathers and Children is about. Fathers and Children is a relatively short book and we're essentially following our main character as he goes back home to his father who owns a farm, and it's about him kind of trying to figure out like what he wants to do with his life, like whether he wants to work with his father and eventually take that farm over, or whether he wants to do something else with his life. I think everybody can relate to that. At its core, it's very much a story about identity and kind of figuring out what it is that you want from life, not just as it relates to your job, but also your relationships, but also the type of life that you want to live. There is obviously a bit more to it than that I would say that is like the central point of the book. And it's quite a short book. It's, in my opinion, probably one of the easiest Russian books to read. Maybe that was also just the translation that I read, which was the Paiman translation, which is the Everyman's Library edition. And it was just such a dream to read, such a dream to read. I think Turgenev is just such a beautiful writer, probably one of the most beautiful writers I've ever read. He's able to create these incredibly vivid descriptions about very mundane things like a garden or a chair or like the sitting room. And yet he writes it in such an engaging way that like you want to soak up every single detail. I am the sort of reader that I don't tend to like a lot of description, mostly because I think a lot of authors aren't that good at writing it and it can often feel very tedious to read. But this is the sort of description that I like because he's so kind of crisp in the way that he describes it. Like there's no floweriness. It's kind of very to the point, but there is a lyrical, poetic nature to it. I have no idea how he kind of gets this balance. Like I can't even imagine how amazing it reads in Russian, but even just the English translation I think captures it really well, and it was just so delightful to read, so delightful to read. I read this book relatively quickly and I think it was because just how beautiful the writing flows. I would probably recommend this book to a lot of people as their first Russian book, and particularly this translation, because it is just an absolute dream to read. Absolute dream to read. Even though this book is quite a short book, like you really feel like you're almost going on a family saga, and you really get an intimate understanding of each of these characters, where they've been, where they are now, and where they may potentially end up by the end of this book. And I think that is just such a testament to Turgenev's writing. Like, I think it's honestly quite astonishing that he's able to flesh these characters out so well in such a small amount of time. And you really do develop a sense of kinship to each of these characters, even if you don't necessarily relate to them. Let's go on to characters a little bit. There are so many great characters in this book. Like I loved every character. It's very rare that like I'm equally intrigued by every single character, but that was definitely the case in this book. It's a pretty like ensemble cast of characters, I would say, but our main character who kind of kicks everything off is Arkady, and Arkady is, I feel like everybody has been in Arkady's position at one point in their life, where you graduate from university and you may have an idea of what you want to do, but you're not necessarily super sure about whether that's the right decision. And so there's a lot of kind of things up in the air, and you're kind of at the same time trying to figure out the sort of person that you want to be as well. He's a very relatable character. I think he's the sort of character that will stick with me for a very long time because his struggle is just so real. And this is one of the many other things that I love about this book, is that this book feels so real. Like, these feel like people that you could know in your own life, even if they weren't Russian, right? Like, I think a lot of Russian books transcend kind of Russian society and culture, and I definitely think that applies to this book, because even though it is very much set like in the Russian countryside, the struggles that these characters go through are just so realistic and so relatable. I've said that word like 10 times already, but I really cannot say anything else beyond that, because these are very human struggles and everyone has probably gone through them at one point in their life. And I just think he captured that so beautifully. We also have another character that I'm gonna call out, which is Arkady's friend. His name is Yevgeny Bazarov, and Bazarov is a really, really great character. Like, one of my favorite types of characters. He's the very intelligent, kind of socially, culturally aware individual, but he lacks a sense of, not self, but there is this very pessimistic outlook on life that I can actually really relate to. And I think Bazarov is the sort of character that, like, you see him go through, without a doubt, the most amount of change. Like, by where he is at the start of the book and his views, and there is a lot of political talk in this book, which I'll come on to in a second. He talks a lot about his views about like society, and it's really interesting to see how his opinions change by the end of the book. There is one, like, I will just call out one particular kind of thread that he picks up on. There's a lot of discussion around love in this book and relationships, particularly marital relationships. He's very much pessimistic about love and the concept of love and whether people can actually love each other romantically. By the end of the book, though, it's really interesting to see how his views completely get upended, but it does feel very organic and it feels very nuanced and realistic. And I think Turgenev did just an absolutely wonderful job of kind of capturing how one's views can be changed by not only the people around you, but the environment around you. And it was just wonderful to read. I wonder how many times I've said the word wonderful now. I'm a little bit jet lagged, folks, so please cut me some slack, okay? We have a really great cast of female characters in this book. We have Fenechka, she's a really interesting character. We also have Anna, who is one of my favorite characters in this book. She's a very interesting character to read because she's widowed, but she's like very, very wealthy. I love seeing a female character who is very much an intellectualist, and she's very like witty and like cutting in the way that she speaks to the people around her, but like not in a way that feels forced. Like, it, I don't know, I just love this character type, particularly for women as well. It's fantastic. It's so fantastic. All the characters in this book are so well written, so well written. Like, you could know these people. They feel so detailed and authentic that I just love it. Like, this is one of those books that I'm going to reread. Like, I very rarely reread books, as I've said before. This is one of the few that I will reread because I literally feel like I know these characters, and I feel like a part of these characters is in me as well, which is always fun and interesting to see and read. As it relates to the thematic work, there's a lot of really fantastic thematic work in this book. As you've probably gathered, there's a lot around identity, as I mentioned earlier, but there's also a lot around like intellectualism, pessimism, and also nihilism, which is something that I studied quite a lot at university, but I've never studied it through like a Russian lens, which was really nice to kind of read. The way that Turgenev weaves philosophy into his books is masterful, absolutely masterful. I feel like classics that have like a very kind of strong philosophical essence to them can sometimes feel and read very dense, but that is not the case in this book. It could be because of the translation, I don't know. The way he weaves it in is just wonderful. If you are somebody who's interested in nihilism, also intellectualism, also liberty, like, these are all things that are discussed in this book that feel, again, very real and very authentic. Like, if you were chatting with a cup of tea with your friends, like, you know, like, it reminds me of like when me and my friends have kind of sat down and we're just chatting about stuff. This is how this book reads for me, because it doesn't feel like pretentious. It doesn't feel like it's trying to portray like a certain view. It's just kind of laying the landscape out through our characters, and you will naturally kind of find yourself aligning with one character at one point, but then another character at another point. And I really loved how kind of organic that felt. There is also really fantastic exploration around the nature of relationships between parents and children. And I really loved how in this book, the parents actually loved their children. That probably sounds so funny, because I feel like a lot of literature, like there's always really fractured relationships between the parents and the children, and I get it. That's because that is the case for a lot of people, unfortunately. But it was so nice to read a book where like the parents genuinely care so much for their children, but at the same time they don't use that care to like manipulate them. They use it to build like a genuinely fortifying relationship with them. And I just love to read it. I love to read it. I like to think that I appreciate my parents a lot, but it made me appreciate like the beautiful relationship that I have with my parents. It kind of reinforced like the importance of having really good relationships with parents, provided that they're like open-minded and kind of willing to trust your judgment. So I really appreciated that. I really loved it. And I really hope that like as I read more classics, I find more discussion around that, because it felt very pure in a way. And even though all relationships can be very much kind of up and down, it's just the nature of life and the nature of people, at the core there is just a lot of love and people trying to understand each other. The last thematic piece that I will mention, there's a ton, but just for the sake of time, is also, actually there's two more that I'm going to talk about. There's one around like marriage and love, as I mentioned earlier. Both of our two male kind of characters, Bazarov and Arkady, are single, and it's very interesting to see how their views of love kind of change and evolve over the course of the book. And then we also have two kind of main female characters who are kind of very different. They're very much opposite. One's much more extroverted, the other one's much more introverted. One's rich, one's, you know, not necessarily poor, but she's not, you know, necessarily going to come with a lot of wealth. And it's really cool to see how Turgenev talks about love, and how love is something that can develop as a result of not just like attraction, but as a result of so much more than that, right? Which is an alignment of values. It's an alignment of kind of not necessarily personality traits, but like certain traits kind of have to match up. Also an alignment of like energy and things like that. So that was really fun. And I really liked how he talked about it, and I actually agree with a lot of kind of what he implies in this book. Naturally, with a book set in the Russian countryside, there's also some really interesting exploration, and this is the last piece that I will mention for the sake of time, around like the role of the serfs, and how the serfs are essentially the children of their masters, and how for them strict parenting is good for them, but also compromising and giving them certain freedoms is also better for the masters overall, if that makes sense. So this book is set very much, as I mentioned at the start, in the Russian countryside. Our two main male characters, Arkady and Bazarov, they come from St. Petersburg, so they've very much been in an urban area where a lot of the aristocracy were, a lot of knowledge and intellectualism being shared there. So coming from that part of the country to a much more rural part of the country, it's really interesting to see how their views on that change. But there is this kind of broader political context, social context in the background about how like the serfs are rising up because they're not being treated fairly, tale as old as time, but how like when compromise can be reached whilst also still being ruled with a strict hand, like that's almost like the best of both worlds. So that was also quite interesting to read. Overall, like this book, I think is one of those books where like not a ton happens. There's no plot per se, but it's really just about life and people living life. Like I think Turgenev does an absolutely phenomenal job of talking about the human condition. There's a lot of like philosophy baked into this book, and it's just like a deeply thematic, deeply character-driven book, and all the characters are so authentic, so real, and they just feel like people that, you know, either you could be or you could know. And I love that, as I've mentioned many times before. And it was just a delight. Honestly, it was just an absolute delight to read. If you are somebody who doesn't read like a ton of classics, like I know a lot of you who watch my channel read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, please do consider like trying this out, because a lot of fantasy does a really good job of talking about the human condition as well, and also sci-fi. But it's just like a different way of writing it, and I think a lot of you who particularly like philosophical fantasy will really enjoy this book, or at least aspects of this book. If you are somebody who loves classics, you got to pick it up. Like, you got to pick it up. What are you doing? Pick it up and let me know down below in the comments when you do, because it is just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It's one of my favorite books that I read last year. It's still a book that I keep thinking about, and I cannot wait to read more Turgenev as a result, because it is a masterpiece. He is just an absolute master at writing. It's phenomenal. So there we have it. Let me know down below in the comments if you have read it. I've not actually met anyone who's read this book, apart from maybe like 1 or 2 people who have commented in the past. But feel free to let me know down below if you have read it or if you are considering reading it. And I will see you in my next video. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up and I will see you very soon. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and take care. Bye.